So I have entitled this talk, Haunted by the Future, What Will, Won't They See of Me? And as Stephen also pointed out earlier, the question driving this exhibition and today's workshop, what will they see of me, is provocative and much more complex than it may at first sight appear. So I want to start by unpacking it a little bit. The tense of the question points to the future. What will they see of me? Thus, it queries what will be or will remain visible at some future point in time, or even indefinitely. The question is concerned with others. What will they see of me? These others are indeterminate, future generations, future publics, of which I will not necessarily be part. As such, the question is about my legacy, what I will leave behind, and how this legacy will be taken up and assessed. It is about my afterlife, about a future haunting, or inability to haunt, if they see nothing, or if they are not compelled by what they see of me. This future haunting is also a present one, as in asking this question, I am haunted, preoccupied, disturbed, obsessed by this afterlife, and the possibility of it being excessive, containing too much of me, parts that I do not want to linger, or lacking, proving my irrelevance and expendability. The question is preoccupied with the visual and visible. What will they see of me? Of all that could possibly remain of me, only that which appears as an image and can be seen is apparently of concern here. Of course, words may also be rendered visible in books, online, and in visual media, as Lucy's from our own correspondent makes clear. It is not just images of the self that visibly and visually proliferate and persist in the digital world, but also our words, status updates on Facebook, tweets, contributions to chats, etc. No longer our own, but once typed, ready to be recovered, repeated, recirculated by countless others. Here, a caveat is in order. In theory, nothing may ever disappear from the internet, not even when Google grants a removal request. But in practice, what lurks in its depths is often difficult to find, and the amount of people seeing or interested in seeing what we post is for most of us not that substantial. It needs to be emphasized that what is visual or visible is not necessarily seen. The anxiety resounding in the question is thus twofold. We fear showing too much of ourselves, but we equally, or perhaps even more strongly, fear remaining invisible in the sense of being overlooked, forgotten. We want to be seen, but only in a certain way and only to a certain extent. This brings me to the final part of the question. What will they see of me? Not how will they see me, but what parts of that which I consider to be me will remain to be visually apprehended. You will note that I do not take me as a given or essence. I see it as socially forged and constructed in the interactions between myself, others, and everything else in the world around me. The self, as the Russian thinker Mikhail Bakhtin has argued, is always still becoming, dialogically, set as a task rather than simply present as a given. The feminist scholar Judith Butler conceives of the self as performative, as congealing over time through our acts, acts that are not free but circumscribed by norms of gender, race, class, ethnicity, etc. These norms are not natural or timeless, but historically and culturally specific. Acting ourselves through such norms does not fully predetermine us. There is some room for change, as we cannot or do not always choose to enact the norms perfectly. Moreover, as Bakhtin insists, every interaction potentially introduces us to another image of ourselves, as it is only the other that can see us from the outside, whereas we experience ourselves from within. When asking what will they see of me, we indulge in a fantasy that there is a me that I can fully comprehend, and that exists as an enduring, self-same, singular entity. This fantasy is encouraged by a company like Facebook, which purports that on my profile I can show all of myself, should I desire to, and that I also have full conscious control of what I do not want to show, or not to certain people. The possibility that I might not know who I am, that I might temporarily not be myself, or that I may wish to present multiple me's to the world, is not recognized by Facebook. In fact, it enforces a single me per user, and polices this me's authenticity, which it aligns with one's documented name on a passport, driver's license, or other official ID. In 2014, Facebook threatened to remove the profiles of transgender and drag queen users appearing under their chosen or staged names. Although there may have been economic reasons for this, forcing performers to open fan pages under their stage name generates revenue, there is also an underlying investment in the idea of every person existing as a singular, real me, of which either the whole or selected parts may be presented to the world. These are only some of the implications of the question, what will they see of me? We could go further by noting that the they need not necessarily be human, or that the see contains a presumption that the present emphasis on visuality and visibility will persist. But I now want to turn to the two artworks and the rich ways in which they engage the question. Although the two works are very different in many respects, not least aesthetically, I want to suggest that they share a concern for rethinking identity, specifically gender identity, beyond the comprehensive, singular, self-same me, and that they both achieve this rethinking through mobilizing complex modes of haunting. To begin with gender identity, this is quite clearly a preoccupation in Marianna's Blood, where the girl Isabel is on the verge of going through puberty, with the bleeding this will involve displaced, in a Freudian manner, onto an operation involving the turbinate bones in her nose, and where the Albanese sworn virgin Lali, born a woman but living as a man, insists, I am myself, I cannot be anyone else. What is at stake in the interactions between Isabel and Lali is whether gender is something that simply is, or something that is constructed or performed, and can therefore also be otherwise. Lali is who he is because of what he presents as a choice. A girl can choose to become a man to escape marriage, or simply for a better life, he says. Yet this choice, it turns out, was not made by Lali, but by his parents, after the death of their son, Lali's brother. Asked by Isabel why he dresses like a man, Lali explains, I am dressed like a man because that's how I've been since childhood. I've done everything as a man. I've felt this way my whole life, and my parents treated me this way. This quote exemplifies how the performance of gender is naturalized retrospectively, according to Judith Butler. Lali traces his being, doing, and feeling like a man back to his earliest childhood, presenting it as preceding his parents treating him like a man, when the chronology is more likely to have been the reverse. His parents' treatment made Lali be, do, and feel like a man, to the extent that he does not feel he could be otherwise, and is convinced that his promise was not imposed, but came from the heart. The quote also glosses over the sacrifice involved, as Lali's status as a sworn virgin means he precisely has not done everything as a man. His freedom to participate in the patriarchal rural society he is part of does not extend to his sexual freedom. Whereas Lali does not comment on this aspect of his life in the work, the photograph shown at its end of Lali and of a young, attractive woman suggests a lament for both the woman Lali never was and the woman, even as a man, he could never have. Thus, while Lali on the one hand exemplifies the fact that gender is a socially constructed role rather than a natural fact, he also embodies the way this does not make gender matter any less, or render it fully flexible. Enacting gender in line with social norms shapes the body, and such shaping is not easily undone. It is, therefore, not just the prohibition on breaking one's vow, or the clear advantages there are to being considered a man in Lali's community that keep him from wanting to change, but also the fact that, in a bodily and habitual sense, he is indeed a man. Gender identity, then, is not simply a question of putting on different clothes or of changing one's mind. This is the lesson Isabel learns from interacting with Lali and from undergoing the operation on her nose. Early on, she asks Lali, "But what if you want to go back?" The voice that answers is not Lali's, but her doctor's. "I'm afraid not, Isabel. What's done is done." This common expression gains a deeper meaning in the context of a performative theory of gender. What's done is indeed done, meaning we reinscribe it through our every act, and therefore not to be undone just like that. Gender, once enacted, becomes ingrained, inculcated, materialized, naturalized, real. Isabel is accused of being a liar and of faking it by the two girls who, in a brilliantly surreal and funny sequence, come to incarnate her extracted turbinate bones. The serious point that is made here is that even though the operation on Isabel's nose is medically sanctioned, the doctor assures her that she will be better off. This does not guarantee its absolute necessity or benefit. Some quick Googling reveals that operations involving the inferior turbinate bones are contentious and may result in more problems than they solve, including the scarily named empty nose syndrome. Medicine, like gender, may seem objective, but is in fact also always still evolving, and to an extent normative. Think of discussions about male circumcision, which have recently become much more prevalent. Because in this case, bodily tissue is literally removed and blood spilled, there is no way back. The turbinate bones can pester and gnaw all they want. Once removed, they cannot re-enter the nose. At the same time, Isabel's answer, "My nose is smooth now that I've removed you," is also contested by the scarring that ensues and threatens to take over her entire face. If we take the operation on Isabel's nose as a displacement of the menstruation taken to signal her becoming a woman, and with that a virgin, the message seems to be that such a physical transition may in itself not make one a woman in any real sense, but if it is taken to do this, will. What's done is done, and will do so at a cost, that of giving up, over time, other possibilities, just as the man's life Lali perceives as one of freedom curtails sexuality. The tension between what one thinks comes naturally and playing a role is also at stake in Lucy's From Our Own Correspondent. One of the interviewed journalists argues that people want to do jobs that come naturally to them, instead of playing some kind of role that doesn't feel right. While the interview fragments focus on professional identity, what does it take to be a good journalist, the answers provided can also be seen to pertain to gender identity. It is certainly not irrelevant that all the journalists interviewed are women. What the answers express is a deep need to make the interview situation appear normal and real, coupled with a realization that this can never be more than a constructed appearance. As one journalist notes, "I think that it's most important to seem interested, act as though it's the most normal thing in the world." Professionalism means making the journalist and as woman disappear. One of the interviewees talks about getting out of the way, making herself smaller and reducing her shadow to make room for the one she's interviewing. This presumes it is possible to be part of a situation without having an identity, a me that expresses and constitutes itself anew in every aspect of our physical presence. Thus, even the avatar that materializes in Lucy's video the potentially ideal woman journalist who would be capable of not actually being there at all and of casting no shadow, cannot live up to this ideal. Despite her monotonous, machinic voice, bland appearance, and encouraging nods to the camera, she does not disappear into the background. In fact, because of the imperfect CGI, she becomes more visible in the uncanny ways in which she never quite seamlessly inhabits her environment. She's always sort of just floating above the bed that she's supposed to be lying on and not quite sitting on it naturally. She is as little at home in the anonymous hotel rooms as her real counterparts, and as unsuccessful in pretending that she is. As a generic, only partially clad woman, moreover, her lonely positioning on the hotel beds invokes another kind of professionalism, that of the prostitute. This association receives a twist in the final scene, when the avatar reveals herself as a subject rather than an object of desire. Looking for contact online, she comes across a chat room where someone is repeating one side of some intimate conversations a male public figure had with women, which went viral and caused a scandal. Although not what I was looking for, the avatar is drawn in by the rhythm of the postings, as night is seen to fall outside the window of the hotel she is in. It is the contrast between the real interviewees' recounting of the tricks of the trade, the acts they perform which enable them to appear natural and get what they want, but only at the price of disappearing themselves, and the fake avatars' recounting of this online encounter that shifts our understanding of identity from a simple equation of, on the one hand, what comes naturally with what is real, and on the other, of what is played with what is fake or inauthentic. The hotel rooms are real, but in their anonymous accumulation come to seem decidedly unreal. The interviewed journalists reveal their naturalness as played, feigned, and the avatar, a patently fake woman that seems all smooth surface and no substance, as emphasized by the surreal scenes in which a fried egg glides off her face and body, is the one who makes a connection online with an unseen, unknown other, a connection that appears genuine. And here I want to refer back to what Josh said about the avatar being the film's repository of awkward humanity. She seems more human, ultimately, than the journalists that are interviewed. As I said at the start of this talk, the question, what will they see of us, projects us into a future of which we might not physically be part any longer, asking us to imagine our own afterlife, how we will remain present in the form of ghostly traces. This brings me to the way both video works are suffused with a sense of haunting. The catalogue description of Blood explicitly presents it as a stark and haunting work, while From Our Own Correspondent is said to contain moments of reverie and fantasy that might also be described as uncanny, in Freud's sense of the familiar become unfamiliar, or downright spooky. Over the past years, I have focused on exploring the prevalence of the figure of the ghost and its main activity, haunting, in both popular culture and cultural theory. In the late 20th century, ghosts appeared everywhere, not just as characters in film, television, and literature, but also in design. Evoked, for example, in Philippe Starck's transparent Louis ghost chair, which is this one, and as potential actualities. Ghost hunting experienced a resurgence, and any self-respecting tourist destination came to feature at least one authentic ghost tour. Moreover, as a metaphor or concept, the ghost or spectre was mobilized by scholars from a range of disciplines across the humanities, arts, and social sciences, to elucidate everything from our relationship to the past, the disjunctions and inequalities produced by present-day globalization, the ungraspable quality of new media, the convolutions of identity, the elusiveness of spaces and places, and the workings of memory and history, especially when traumatic. The attraction of the figure of the ghost or spectre lies in its capacity to capture, in all their complexity, but also in readily accessible form, who hasn't seen a ghost film or read a ghost story, phenomena that are both present and absent, both alive and dead, both material and immaterial, and both visible and invisible. The so-called spectral turn was inaugurated in the early 1990s by French philosopher Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx, which explores the multiple afterlives of Karl Marx through a reading of the paternal ghost in Shakespeare's Hamlet, and by American sociologist Avery Gordon's Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, which argues that sociology should not only concern itself with what is manifestly present, but also with what has been lost or disavowed, but lingers in the form of traces that demand active acts of recovery. Derrida and Gordon were followed by a myriad of elaborations of spectrality, methodologically distinct and varying in the characteristics, functions, and effects they assign to the ghost and its penchant to haunt. Some interrelated emphases can be distinguished, however. First, there is the evocation of the ghost as a figure of return, capable of expressing the persistence of the past in the present, and the general workings of repetition as inevitably combining sameness and difference. The ghost, after all, is never identical to who it was when it was still alive, and it may reappear in different forms and moods. Second, there is the appeal to the ghost as a present absence, or visible invisibility. Despite being ephemeral, something is there that matters and has to be taken into account. Ghosts, once noticed, are not to be ignored. This makes it possible to consider the social, political, ethical, psychological, and affective impacts of re-knowing or unforgetting phenomena previously overlooked or unprocessed. Approach to the concept of spectrality, these phenomena are not made present or visible in a straightforward manner, but manifest in and as their absence or invisibility, so that their escaping notice remains part of their signification. A third focus is on examining the ghost's potency as a critique of the unmixed, of the idea that certain things, including identity, are fully autonomous, pure, and self-sufficient, like the fantasy of the me as a singular, self-same entity I discussed earlier. The ghost, as Derrida argues, is never just one, but what he calls le plus d'un, the more than one, no more one, always already multiple and heterogeneous. As such, it undermines notions of absolute origins, absolute presence, and any absolute distinction between past, present, and future, or between the here and the elsewhere. While work on spectrality has generally been productive, from the beginning of the spectral turn, there has been an anxiety about the figures of the ghost and haunting becoming overstretched, generalized to the point of meaninglessness. If we see ghosts and haunting everywhere, can these figures still serve to make a distinct point? Or do they become mere rhetorical flourishes? In my book, The Spectral Metaphor, Living Ghosts and the Agency of Invisibility, I insist that invocations of spectrality should include a careful motivation of how this figure is employed and what is gained or lost in its use. When we say something is ghostly, in what sense is it ghostly? What elements or characteristics of the ghost does it mobilize? When we say something haunts, what exactly do we mean by this? Is it even appropriate to assume that all ghosts are capable of haunting? And when we say that the ghost exists in between visibility and invisibility, what kinds of visibility and invisibility are we talking about? What exactly can we see of the ghost, and what exactly can it see of us? With regard to blood, then, I want to ask what it is that renders this work haunting. Does it have to do with the dreamlike atmosphere of the scenes in rural Albania, with Isabel's incongruous presence in the village, with the surreal image of the huge disembodied nose, or the way the two girls come to embody the turbinate bones? Is it the fact that images, events, and words recur insistently? Or is it because of the frightening supernatural tale about the woman sucking the blood out of Lali's brother? I would say that all these elements contribute to what makes the work haunting, yet to me, the most powerful and significant evocation of haunting is in the relationship between Lali and Isabel. While Lali, administering to Isabel in his white hat and inciting her to follow him, initially seems the more ghostly of the two, oscillating between appearing as benevolent guardian and threat, I want to suggest that their relationship can, in fact, be seen as one of mutual haunting. Lali, in appearing to Isabel as both man and woman, blurs the comfortingly rigid gender binary the girl clings to as she approaches puberty. Her encounter with Lali, much like that with the animated turbinate bones, initiates her into a more shadowy, ambivalent realm, where distinctions become relationalities or continuums, so that a woman may also be a man, and what is excised from your body may nevertheless still make a claim on it. At the same time, Isabel, by appearing, apparently out of nowhere, to Lali, asking insistent questions, and, most ghost-like, turning up repeatedly by the side of his bed, brings him into contact with another time and place, where his decision to become a man because, and I quote Lali, a woman is a sack made to endure, may be challenged. His certainty that becoming a man was the only way to be free, even though it meant giving up on a sexual life, is shaken by Isabel, who brings another place and another time, a different present, and a potentially different future into his world, disjointing it in the manner of Derrida's spectre. When Isabel insists, "I don't need to be a man to be free," Lali answers, "Your life is different from the one we had. We couldn't take part in family meetings, couldn't go out. All women were forced to do housework and things. There was no freedom for women in those times." Isabel, insisting on countering this description of the past, of how things were in those times, with her incomprehension that things still have to be this way for Lali in the present, haunts him by showing him that the present and the future could indeed be different, if only the absolute, unmixed categories and equivalences the community lives by, a woman is designed to suffer, being a man, even without a sexual life, is freedom, and blood can only be paid for with blood, would be abandoned in fear of more ambiguous entanglements. By configuring the relationship of Isabel and Lali as a mutual haunting that moves from fear and suspicion to a form of effective understanding, each is given the power to show the other something new of him or herself. Rather than portraying Lali as a figure of the past and of the non-West that haunts, in a melancholic, shameful way, or as a quaint curiosity, our Western present-day gender configurations, which is how images of Albanian sworn virgins tend to function in other media and artworks, Marianna opens up the possibility of Lali haunting Isabel in a way that potentially deconstructs her rigid binary idea of gender, making clear that the sworn virgin, apart from making visible traditional gender roles, also allows us to see that all gender is played in the performative sense, and that this makes gender distinctions far from absolute. By having Isabel also haunt Lali as a figure of potentiality, suggesting that what was the past does not have to be repeated in the present and into the future, a dialogue is established between the gender configurations of the places and times at play, rendering haunting multidirectional and undercutting preconceptions that would automatically and simplistically render the blonde, blue-eyed girl unthreatening, and the foreign, strangely dressed man, steeped in tradition, a danger. Thus, the enigmatic encounters between Isabel and Lali embody the way a ghostly apparition causes time and space to be put out of joint. In addition, they evoke the ethics of haunting, which Derrida summarizes as an imperative to not try to exorcise the ghost because it disturbs, but instead to try to live with it and to welcome it in all its otherness without trying to assimilate it. Significantly, the first word we hear and see Lali speak directly to Isabel is welcome. Later, he tells his friends that she is a guest in his house, a guest of the house, of my house, and that she is in our Bessa, my Bessa. Bessa is the concept of hospitality Lali's community lives by. As we learn later on, it is supposed to be what Derrida calls an absolute form of hospitality, as opposed to one that imposes conditions. Once welcomed, the invitation cannot be undone or restricted. Thus, when Isabel strays into the tower against Lali's will, Lali's friends tell him that he has to forgive her, for when someone is in Bessa, he is always forgiven. Lali tries to argue with them, but eventually agrees to forgive Isabel. Let it be like that. Again, the relation is one of mutuality, as Isabel also forgives him later on, when she tells him she does not blame him for the blood. In the end, they both allow themselves to be haunted, even when it shakes them to the core to be followed and pestered by the other, to be confronted by the radical alterity of another place and another time, to be faced with what the other sees of them, not just in the future, but in the present. Besides haunting as an insistent following, in Dutch, to be haunted can only be translated as to be followed or persecuted. Blood also evokes haunting's association with repetition and return. From the initial scene of the girls spinning each other around, to the repeated image of Isabel's nose being cleaned of blood, to the scene in which she appears multiple times at Lali's bedside and is carried by him to her own bed, there is an intimation that nothing is really done or gone, that everything will return, just as the video itself, played on a loop, will repeat itself. What makes these returns haunting is that the repetition is never completely identical. A ghost is not a resurrection, but a return of the one who used to be alive in a different form, and each return of the ghost, in turn, differs in its impact. The first reappearance is not the same as the 10th, and so on. Accordingly, the repeated references to blood in the images and in the words spoken stand in relation to each other without becoming equivalent, while the scenes between Isabel and Lali repeat certain patterns, but also show their relationship developing. Repetition with difference is also an organizing principle in From Our Own Correspondent. The hotel rooms between which the camera cuts, sometimes almost imperceptibly, are generic but not identical, and the remarks of the 4 interviewed journalists, who all somewhat resemble each other, at least that's what I thought, maybe that's just my thing, but they also echo each other with small variations, while the avatar, which appears as the ghostly amalgamation of what they describe as the ideal journalist, also transforms this ideal image by bringing her desires to the fore. The story she tells about the chat room conversation that inadvertently, "it was not what I was looking for," captured her attention, itself revolves around a haunting repetition. The public figure's contributions to the conversations that caused the scandal, and potentially his disappearance from the public stage, live on in the digital world, beyond his control, and are being repeated in the chat room, reviving the past. Yet, rather than replicating the public figure's humiliation, the fact that only one side of the conversations is reproduced, and that it is being reproduced as if for the first time, not as a finished transcript, but as part of a new conversation or encounter, posted line by line, introduces an element of difference and an anticipation of possible change. Perhaps the next line won't be a reiteration. As Derrida notes, haunting has a curious, complex temporality. The first appearance of the ghost is already a reappearance, and also announces its future return. A haunting is only a haunting if there are multiple sightings of the ghost. Past, present, and future are all involved. Thus, the chatroom visitors that report the user for reposting, an act seen to violate the rule that in a chatroom you speak as yourself, even if this self is a fabrication, miss the point. They seek to exorcise the ghost that, for them, only repeats the past as it was. The avatar's response, however, reveals how this haunting also pertains to the present and the future. The rhythm of the repostings, which she experiences as too slow, allows them to intervene in her present, fascinating her, and eventually lulling her to sleep, whereas the preponderance of questions makes her wonder whether an answer is looked for, an answer from her that would therefore differ from the answers provided by the original interlocutors, and that might steer the conversation in a new direction, taking it off script. Perhaps, more than reinforcing a fear that what we show and say through new media might return to haunt us, and that it may therefore not be within our control to determine what they, whoever this may be, will see of us. The avatar's story shifts the focus of the question around from the me to the they, suggesting that what remains of me in the future is not just of interest to me, but may come to haunt whoever comes across it in unexpected ways that might produce something new for them or of them. In the end, what will they see of me is perhaps too self-centered, and self-centering a question. We should not take the me or the they in this question for granted, but see them both as shaped by their relationality, their inevitable entanglement. We should also perhaps reverse the question to ask, what will I see of them? For the online journalists interviewed in From Our Own Correspondent, this might mean thinking less about how they come across in the interview process and more about how they position their subjects. In relation to Lali, it could mean following Blood in trying to see Albanian sworn virgins as more than curiosities exemplifying an outdated form of life, and little blonde-haired, blue-eyed girls as more than symbols of innocence. Thank you.